Hello, and welcome to the Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian Pagan and Kemetic practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon. I've had several questions about the ancient Egyptian calendar, and particularly in regards to some things that I discussed in Circle of the Sun, where I give information on a couple of different ritual calendars. This is actually a pretty complicated topic. Those of you who might be familiar with eCauldron, another pagan forum, there's several archived discussions having to do with Kemetic religion, and one of the topics was Egyptian calendars, reckoning New Year's, and things of that sort. The general consensus I noticed was, math makes brain hurt. I can certainly sympathize, so hopefully I can give you some clarification on that here. And also, this will be a little bit of a sneak preview. I've been asked to do a topic at the Greater New Orleans Pagan Pride Day, which will be in September. So, this is sort of boning up for my 45-minute lecture that I'll be giving there. The Egyptians had two calendars that they used. The primary one is called the civil calendar, and that one was divided into 12 months, just like ours, but it was 30 days apiece. You didn't have the variation like we have in our calendar, where you've got 28 days in February, 31 in November, December, and so on. And of course, if you happen to be good at math, 12 times 30 gives you 360. That leaves you with 5 extra days. The Greeks called those the epagamental days, but the Egyptians called them the 5 days upon the year. And that rounded out their calendar. They had 3 seasons instead of our 4. Most of us live in a temperate climate, but being in a desert, their seasons worked a little differently. They primarily were regulated by the Nile. So hopefully if this... there we go. By the way, I have these because ideally I would love to do some computer graphics and integrate those in there, but there's only 24 hours in a day, so this will have to do. But your Egyptian seasons began with Akhet, and that was the flood season when the Nile would flood, so the water was high. You couldn't do any planting then, obviously. Alright, next one. Peret, or some sources will give it as Proyet. I believe that's drawing from the Coptic version of the word. The next one would be Shomu. Peret is the growing season. That's when, it's also called emergence. You could think of that as when the ground is emerging from the floodwaters, and then when the plants are emerging from the ground after they've been planted. The last one would be Shemu, or Shomu, which comes from the Egyptian word for hot. And that was basically the hot season, the summertime. Hopefully you guys can read this. And you'll see in the smaller text here, Akhet runs roughly from July to November, depending on when you start New Year's. Peret is from November through March, and Shomu is about March through July. Again, there's a caveat. It depends on when you start New Year's. That is a big issue when you're dealing with Egyptian calendars. New Year's began when the Nile started to flood, but another thing that happened, like clockwork, was the rising of the star Sirius, or Sopdut in Egyptian. You can find Sirius, and it's not a radio station. Sopdut is next to Orion. Hopefully these graphics will be reasonably understandable. Okay, if you know what Orion looks like, you can see it here, and Sirius is going to be down and to the lower left. Just find the kilt, basically, of Orion, and then Sirius will be next to it. Some fun facts about Sirius. It is about 9 light years away from Earth. It is the brightest star in the night sky, and it's technically not one star, but it is a binary star. There are 2 in a very close orbit, and that's part of the reason why it's so bright. if that was a little difficult to understand, excuse me a sec, Sirius is going to be off to the side of the kilt. Sirius is in the constellation Canis Major. Now, I can't make out Canis Major, but according to everything that's been mapped out, it would look sort of like this. Sirius is kind of towards the neck of the dog, and then you'd have the legs coming out and the body down like this. You know, if you happen to find it. Of course, if you live in an area with a lot of light pollution, you know, that's going to be rather difficult. Another thing to keep in mind is at this time of year, being the end of May, beginning of June, you're not going to see Orion or Sirius at all, because it appears to set, meaning that it no longer becomes visible in the night sky around this time of year. 70 days later, it comes back again. And what specifically happens is Sirius will rise above the horizon right before the sun does. Right before the sun comes up, and that light just wipes out all the stars in the night sky. That is called the heliacal rising of Sirius. Reckoning the new year with relation to Sirius is probably one of the biggest points of contention with Kemetics, and so I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. The other calendar that the Egyptians used was a lunar calendar, and lunar calendars are still used by the Chinese, Judaism, and Islam. And what's interesting, have you ever noticed that the Chinese New Year, Passover, and Ramadan all began at different points in the year? It's not like, say, for example, Christmas, which is always on December 21st. That's because the lunar cycle is not the same as the solar. A lunar year is 354 days instead of 365. And so you have dates that sort of move. In fact, you eventually get an extra lunar month. And they have names for it in the Jewish calendar, you know, and I'm sure they have something similar in the Islamic calendar. But I talk about lunar phases in Circle of the Sun because obviously lunar observances, if you're a Wiccan, those are very important because esbits are based on the phases of the moon. So if you want to pursue Tamarin Wicca, I wanted to provide a resource for doing observances that would be a little bit more closely based on the Egyptian lunar calendar. Interestingly, the Egyptian lunar month began with the new moon, not as it does in, I believe, Judaism and Islam, where the first visible crescent starts the new month. With the Egyptians, it would be the new moon proper. And the lunar cycle represented the cycle of the Eye of Horus. And at the new moon, it was wounded, it was, you know, it was at its, you know, hidden point. First crescent, it's starting to heal. And that was called Abed. Then a few days later you have Senut, which is the 6th day feast, and then first quarter, which can be 1 to 2 days afterwards. The funny thing with the moon is a true lunar cycle, a lunar month, is 28 days. But the Egyptians, even in their lunar calendar, used 30 days. And so you had to build in a little bit of leeway. And that has to do with the way the moon orbits the Earth. It's not, you know, a perfect circle, and it's not. There are points where it's closer and points when it's further out. So a lunar cycle will be, on average, 28 days, but in actuality it can be 27 or even 29. So you get some discrepancy. And if you go to almanac.com or another site that tracks the moon for, you know, pagan purposes, you know, whatever, you'll notice that there are points where, you know, if you were to count the days out, there'd be a little discrepancy. But on average, okay, you have new moon, first crescent, first quarter. Full moon for the Egyptians was actually at the half point of the month. So texts would refer to the half month feast. They're talking about the new moon, or excuse me, the full moon. Then the cycle starts back and you have the waning moon and last quarter. An interesting thing is you have 2 days that are referred to as Denit, and they happen to be at the first and the last quarter. Then you have the last visible crescent before new moon. That was a time when, they had different metaphors for the moon. The Eye of Horus was one. If you're talking about a moon god like Jehuti or Khonsu or Yah, he was conceived on the new moon, an infant at first crescent, a growing child through the waxing moon, a full-grown man at the full moon, and then aging, and then finally dies at the last crescent to be reconceived and reborn with the next month. So that's another way to interpret the lunar cycle. And if you want to work with goddesses, you have the goddess who is distant at new moon, and she's coming back, and she's home at the full moon, but then starts to go away again as the moon wanes. Now, back to the issue with finding out when New Year's is. Because that's very important. If you want to track, okay, when is, say for example, when are the Osiris mysteries? Well, that's going to be at the end of the flood season and before the start of Peret. So when do we start the count? In ancient times, Sirius rose on July 18th or 19th. And there are certain folks that still observe that today. Church of the Eternal Source has been observing Egyptian New Year's as July 18th or 19th since before the 1970s. And it's funny, even before I was a official, Kemetic pagan, I still was doing things to observe Egyptian New Year on July 18th ever since about 89 or 90. So I've got a little bit of a sentimental, attachment to that particular date. The funny thing is the way you have something called precession of the equinoxes, and it has to do with the movements of the heavens. Keep in mind that we feel like we're standing still, but the Earth is orbiting around the Sun is moving itself within the Milky Way galaxy, and the Milky Way galaxy is moving too, so all the other stars are moving in relation to it. That means that Sirius rises at a different point now than it did in 3,000 years ago. Now it rises in Egypt on July 25th, but it rises at a different point in other parts of the world. To best explain why this is, hopefully a picture will help. If you can picture the Earth, and I've got it right here, and here's Africa. Remember, okay, this is the east. Everything rises in the east. So Sirius rises and becomes visible just over the horizon right before the sun. And this happens in Egypt on July 25th. Well, if you were to go further west, the UK, it's at a different latitude, and so it would be visible at a different point. What day? I'm not sure. Somebody would have to go and calculate that out, because if you do a Google search, you're not going to find it. That's part of the problem. Calculating when Sirius is going to be visible in your area is very difficult. We do know that further over to the west in North America, and the U.S. in particular, it rises from, here, let's see if I can get this to where you can see it, about August 3rd through the 8th. Keep in mind, the East Coast is going to be further ahead from the central U.S. and Joliet, Illinois, for example, which is further ahead of San Francisco. All of those are points that have been discussed as reference points for when to start the new year. Because, of course, you have the Kemetic Orthodox based in Joliet, Illinois. You have the Temple of Ra in San Jose that's close to San Francisco. And there's almost a week worth of difference between those groups and when they start their new year, which makes it very complicated. My advice, the position I take is, for one, keep it simple, stupid. KISS is the best way to do a lot of things. if you were to say, all right, Timbuktu here is our reference point, and that's when we're going to start the new year because that's when you can see Sirius. Well, anybody not living in Timbuktu no longer, that it may not be appropriate to them anymore. For example, you poor folks in the UK, you're observing New Year's based on when somebody can see it in the US. One possibility, and this would be drawing from things the Egyptians themselves did, is pick a point to start the calendar, but then have an observance for Peret Sopdut, which is the emergence of Sirius, and treat those as separate events. Another thing would be to say, all right, we're going to use July 25th as our start date because that's when Sirius would be visible in its, well, not the star's homeland, but the Kemetic homeland, being Egypt. That would be a very fair point of reference because it's not giving preference to anybody else. It's just saying, hey, this is where we're looking to for our inspiration. This is where we would be starting. Or again, using July 18th, that's taking a historical point of reference. But again, you could, celebrate Sirius coming up over your area when it would be appropriate. With regard to the lunar calendar, that doesn't sync up with the civil calendar very often. And actually, that's a point of issue with, if you might recall, in Following the Sun, the beautiful Feast of the Reunion, where Hathor would go to visit Horus. That was determined by the phase of the moon, which might be different from the beginning of the third month of Shomu. So I give that date as the 7th of Apip, third Shomu in Following the Sun. But if you were to say, okay, I'm going to observe it on when the new moon, the full moon falls in that month, that would actually be a little more correct to how they would have done it. So you've got some leeway. The Egyptian calendar can be very complicated, but in order to make it something usable and a reference point from which you can actually practice, the best approach, I think, is to integrate it into the secular calendar that we use today, because it's something all of us know as a frame of reference. We learned this, January, February, and so on, ever since we were little, and it would give us the best, point of departure in order to integrate this into our own lives, which is what Egyptian paganism is all about. We're taking the ancient references, the ancient precedents, and adapting them to our lives, because, we just think about the advantages that we have in timekeeping, for example. You have atomic clocks that can be so mathematically precise. What's funny is using the sun and the moon and the stars as a reference point is close, but there are discrepancies. Probably the most famous with the Egyptian calendar is the fact that they didn't account for leap years until actually it became law under the Emperor Augustus. One of the Ptolemies tried to issue a decree in 237 BC saying, let's put a leap year day, an extra Pagamental day, in every 4 years, so you'd have 6 that year instead of 5. But the Egyptians didn't like that idea, and they actually preferred a calendar which did not sync up with actual events, but once every 1,456 years. So they didn't know because they didn't have the means of keeping time that we do now. So let's take advantage of what we have today and make things a little simpler, because I'm sure even the ancients would appreciate, what we have now. Hopefully this will give you some food for thought and some reference points for your own practice. So, for the Kemetic How-To Guide, this is Sharon wishing you Senut.